The first time I knew Mrs. Banks didn't love me was when I heard what she did at the church sale. Someone told me she spotted my mother's Baroque china under those fluorescent lights, price tags on it like it was garage sale junk. And she didn't sound shocked. She sounded robbed. They said her voice went tight, like somebody slapped her in public. Not because it was wrong, because it was hers, in her mind. And for 1 second, the mask slipped. I wasn't supposed to be standing there in her story. I was supposed to be the grateful orphan, the church's favorite God moment, a quiet little prop with good manners. But let me rewind, because none of this started with the china. It started with a hit and run, and a 10-year-old girl who learned real fast what adults will say out loud versus what they'll do behind closed doors. My parents died when I was 10. A car hit them and kept going. No note, no apology, no justice. Just a phone call that turned my whole life into a before and after. My dad was only 39. My mom was 35. And the part people love to whisper in small towns? My dad had money. Not billionaire money, but enough that he didn't have to grind himself to dust to prove he mattered. He hated the city. So my parents moved to this tiny church-going town where everyone knew your car, your dog, and your business. My dad opened a little antique shop. My mom collected pieces like they were time capsules. Old wood, old glass, old stories. When they died, there were no relatives waiting in the wings. No aunt with a spare bedroom. No grandparents with warm hands and cookies. Just paperwork. And the word orphanage hovering over my head like a storm cloud. That's when Mr. and Mrs. Banks stood up in church and turned my grief into a performance. I still remember the way Mrs. Banks' voice got soft and syrupy. The kind of tone people use when they want applause for being good. She said, something like, "A little girl needs a loving home, and God has given us this joyous task." It was probably not those exact words, but it was that exact energy. Cringe, wholly dramatic. And the congregation ate it up. Everyone smiled at them like they'd just adopted a puppy from a shelter. Except I wasn't a puppy. I was a kid who just buried both parents. They already had a daughter, Kitty, 1 year older than me. And in public, they'd push her toward me like, "Go on, sweetheart, hug your new sister." Kitty would do it with the dead-eyed patience of someone being forced to pose for a Christmas card. Here's the part that matters, because it explains everything that came next. The Banks weren't just helping. They were getting paid. They received a stipend from the state to foster me, and they got monthly checks from my dad's estate. Money meant to take care of me until I turned 18. And at 18, the trust would become mine. All of it. Full control. That's what the town thought the story was. A sweet Christian couple saving a little girl. A happy ending blessed by God. But in that house, I wasn't a daughter. I was a receipt. And once I understood that, I started watching everything. Because if you're going to survive people like that, you don't just pray, you track. By the time the first social worker came to check on me, the Banks already had me trained like an actor in their little church play. The first social worker came on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because Mrs. Banks started cleaning like the house was on fire. Not real cleaning, the kind of cleaning that's mostly rearranging evidence. Pillows fluffed, counters wiped, Bibles placed where people could see them. Like God was a brand and she was setting up the display. Then she sat me down at the kitchen table and slid into that voice again. Soft, sweet, rehearsed. "Now, honey," she said, smiling too hard. "When the lady asks, you tell her how safe you feel here." I stared at the wood grain, nodded, and kept my mouth shut. Mr. Banks joined in like it was a family devotion. "Remember," he said, "we're blessed to have you." And it sounded nice, until you heard the second meaning underneath it. "You're lucky we took you." They didn't ask what I needed. They told me what to say. When the social worker arrived, Mrs. Banks became a different person. She moved around me like I was a prize on a ribbon, a hand on my shoulder, a laugh at my jokes. She called me sweet girl and our little miracle, like she'd invented me. Kitty came down the stairs on command. Mrs. Banks gave her that look, smile or else. So Kitty smiled, not with her eyes, with her teeth. The social worker asked gentle questions. How was school? Did I have my own space? Did I feel safe? Mrs. Banks answered half of them for me, like I was too young to have a voice. And I did what I always did back then. I performed. Because I understood something even at 10. If I ruined their little show, I'd pay for it later. So I said the lines. They're nice. I'm okay. I'm grateful. Short, clean, safe. The second the door closed behind that woman, the air changed. Mrs. Banks' smile fell right off her face like it had weight. Mr. Banks went back to the living room. Kitty vanished, and I was standing there in the kitchen, suddenly invisible again. No, are you hungry? No, do you want to talk about your parents? No bedtime check-in, just silence. And the sound of Mrs. Banks clicking through a catalog on the computer, like she'd been holding her breath until she could spend money again. I started noticing the pattern. In public, they were cotton candy, sweet and sticky and fake. In private, they were glass, cold, clear, sharp. And the thing is, they weren't openly cruel. That's what made it so hard to explain. They didn't hit me, they didn't scream every day. They just used me. I wasn't their daughter. I was their proof. Proof they were godly. Proof they were generous. Proof they were the kind of people the town should admire. And the checks coming in every month? Those were the fuel for the whole performance. Because while I was wearing hand-me-downs and learning not to ask for anything, Mrs. Banks started getting new things. Small things first, packages, deliveries, a new purse, a new coat. Mr. Banks started talking like a man blessed with success. Then the bigger stuff started showing up. Trips, upgrades, nice dinners they didn't invite me to. And whenever someone at church complimented them, "Oh, you two are such angels for taking her in," Mrs. Banks would tilt her head and say, "We're just doing what the Lord asked." The town thought they were donating love. They were investing in reputation. And I kept smiling, because I realized something that made my stomach go cold. If they could choreograph a social worker, they could choreograph anyone. So I stopped hoping they'd change, and I started paying attention to what changed around them. What came in the mail, what disappeared from the house, what showed up in the driveway that shouldn't have been there. And when I finally understood where the money was coming from, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to confront them with feelings, because feelings don't scare people like the banks, but paper does. By middle school, I stopped waiting for warmth. I started watching patterns. Because in that house, patterns told the truth faster than people did. The checks arrived like clockwork. State money, estate money, trust money. And every time one hit their account, Mr. Banks' posture changed, like he'd earned it. They acted broke, right up until my money cleared. I'd hear little speeches at dinner. God provides. We're doing so well because we're disciplined. Or my favorite, Mr. Banks talking about smart investments, like he was Warren Buffett with a Bible. Then the new stuff started stacking up around them. Not necessities, upgrades, status, little trophies. And I'd sit there, 14 years old, doing the math in my head like a quiet accountant. Their lifestyle didn't match their jobs, and I wasn't stupid. Mrs. Banks loved to imply I owed them. She never said it straight. She didn't have to. It was always the same pressure, dressed up as virtue. Be grateful. Be generous. When you're older, you'll understand what we sacrificed. And I'd nod like a good kid. Because I knew something she didn't. I could be grateful and still keep score. She thought guilt was a leash. I treated it like a warning label. The more I grew up, the more I noticed what quietly disappeared. My mom's antiques, pieces that used to sit in her shop, that were supposed to be mine, started showing up in Mrs. Banks' decor. Then they'd vanish again, gifted to Kitty, handed off to relatives, donated to the church for applause. And every time someone at church said, "Mrs. Banks, you're so generous," she'd smile like she was feeding hungry children, when really, she was handing away my mother's life. She wasn't donating her things. She was donating my inheritance. Then there was the china set. Not the everyday stuff. Not the cute little teacups she kept on display like props. I'm talking about the one thing my mom never kept at the store because it was too valuable. An absolutely complete, Baroque-era fine china set. Old world. Heavy. Perfect. The kind of thing you don't replace. I didn't grow up dreaming about plates. My mom taught me that stuff is just stuff, and honestly, I believed her. But that china set wasn't about wanting it. It was about who got to decide where it went. Mrs. Banks would stand there, touching the cabinet like it was her altar, and say, casual as breathing, "This will go to Kitty on her wedding day." She said it like the decision was already made, and I was too dumb to notice. Wrong lady, not yours. And the crazy part? Mrs. Banks truly believed I didn't care. Because I dressed like a tomboy. Because I didn't fawn over lace and porcelain and the feminine little fantasies she wanted me to want. So she assumed I wouldn't fight her on it. That I wouldn't even recognize theft if it wore a pearl necklace and quoted scripture. That's the thing about people like her. She didn't see me as a person. She saw me as an obstacle with a birthday. And that birthday, 18, was coming. Which meant the trust would become mine. And the checks would stop. That's when I saw the real panic underneath all the godly performance. Suddenly, they talked more about family, more about gratitude, more about what I should do for them when I got control. So I did the one thing they never expected from the quiet foster kid in the back of the room. I stopped listening and started verifying. I called the trust office myself and asked for every statement they'd kept away from me. Because if I was going to leave, I wanted receipts in my hands. The trust office didn't treat me like a problem. They treated me like the beneficiary, which was new. A few calls, a couple forms, and suddenly I had what the banks never wanted me to see. Statements, dates, amounts, where the money went. Cold, boring paper that felt like oxygen. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was reading. I laid everything out on my bed like a crime scene. Quarterly statements, notes I'd made in the margins for years. And then I started building it, page by page, into a 3-ring binder. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted control. And the banks had been living off the fact that I didn't have any. At school, I kept my grades up. I played quiet, applied out of state, and I got a partial scholarship, enough to open the door. The rest, I could cover once I turned 18. That was the whole point of the trust. It was supposed to launch my life, not fund theirs. They were spending my future while preaching about my gratitude. The closer my 18th birthday got, the more the banks started circling me like sharks that smelled the end of the buffet. Mrs. Banks would lean on the counter, sweet as pie. "You know," she'd say, "a godly young woman remembers who raised her." Mr. Banks would add, "We didn't have to do this, you know. We took you in." They never said, "Pay us." They said, "Bless us." Same demand, better packaging. They weren't asking for thanks. They were invoicing my childhood. So I started logging the blessings, the stuff that didn't match an insurance salesman paycheck and a stay-at-home mom hobby. A brand new Volvo, paid in cash. A second used car for Kitty, also cash. Trips that magically appeared on the calendar. Hawaii, New York. Fancy clothes for Kitty. And those big church donations that made people clap. Like the money came from their hearts instead of my dead parents. I wrote each one down. Date, approximate cost, what it was, and where I was when it happened. Usually sitting at home, invisible, while they played generous in public. Every gift they gave the church was a billboard with my name scrubbed off. By then, Kitty was off at college, and I didn't need anyone to spell it out for me. My parents' money was underwriting her whole new life. I didn't blame Kitty the way I blamed them. She was a kid raised inside the same performance. But I did resent the math, because the math said I was the one paying to be treated like an inconvenience. So I made my own plan. I booked my travel to campus. I packed light, because I didn't have much that felt like mine in that house. And I made a quiet promise to myself. I wasn't coming back. The Banks didn't even see me off. They didn't hug me, didn't stand in the driveway, nothing. Because in their minds, I wasn't leaving. I was just going away for a minute, then returning to hand them what they thought they'd earned. And 3 days. Before I drove out of town, I checked the church bulletin and saw it. Our annual antique sale extravaganza was about to start. In our town, the church didn't just run Sunday service. It ran the social scoreboard. If people loved you there, you were good. If they didn't, you felt it everywhere. And every year we had the big antique sale extravaganza. Tables in the fellowship hall, little handwritten tags, ladies from all over the county circling like sharks, politely. The Banks thought they were about to cash out on my guilt. Instead, I cashed out their image. 3 days before I left for college, I waited for the exact moment I needed. Mr. and Mrs. Banks were out. Another quick run that turned into hours. Shopping, browsing, spending like consequences didn't exist. The house was quiet. No sermon voice, no fake smile. Just me, the cabinet, and that Baroque china set sitting behind glass like a trophy. I didn't rush. I didn't shake. I wrapped each piece the way my mom taught me. Careful, respectful, like it mattered. Not because I worshipped porcelain, but because I refused to let Mrs. Banks rewrite what was mine. I wasn't stealing it. I was reclaiming it, with a receipt trail. I boxed the full set, loaded it up, and drove straight to the church. The rummage sale committee was already setting up. Folding tables, cash box, clipboards, that smell of old wood and lemon cleaner. I walked in carrying a cardboard box like it weighed nothing, but I could feel my pulse in my throat. Not fear, anticipation. I found the ladies in charge and smiled like I belonged there. "Mrs. Banks asked me to bring this by," I said. "She wanted to donate it for the sale. All the proceeds should go to the church." They lit up instantly. Of course they did. In this town, donation was a love language. I added, very calmly, "The donation should be listed in the name of Mr. and Mrs. Banks." Because I wasn't cruel, I was fair. If Mrs. Banks was as godly as she advertised, she'd be thrilled. I gave her exactly what she claimed to be, on paper. Then I watched their faces change when they opened the box. Even church ladies have tells. A sharp inhale, a hand over the mouth, a quick glance like, is this real? Because it wasn't some dusty teapot set. It was museum level, complete, pristine, expensive. I told them the value, tens of thousands. Not to brag, to make sure they treated it like what it was, and not like a pile of thrift store dishes. One of them whispered, "Praise the Lord," like she'd just seen a miracle. Another one said, "Mrs. Banks is so generous." I smiled and nodded. Then I handed them a piece of paper with a phone number. "If you need proof of ownership or permission to sell," I said, "contact this attorney in New York. He can confirm everything." They thanked me like I'd personally funded the roof repair for the next decade. And they promised me they'd display it carefully. Front table, center stage. The trap wasn't the china. The trap was the credit. I left, before anyone could ask too many questions. I didn't stay to watch them tag it. I didn't hang around to be seen. Because the whole point was simple. When Mrs. Banks discovered it, there needed to be only one version of the story. The church's version. And the church's version was this. Mrs. Banks donated the most valuable item they'd ever had. A saint, a giver, a shining example. I wasn't there on the second day of the sale. That was Mr. and Mrs. Banks' shift. And I made sure I was nowhere near the fellowship hall when the show started. But I heard what happened. Apparently, Mrs. Banks didn't walk in like a donor. She walked in like someone spotted her jewelry on a stranger. The moment she saw that china set on the table, she lost it. Not a quiet, wounded gasp, a full-body meltdown. She started insisting it had been stolen from her house. She started demanding they take it off the table. She started asking who bought what, because pieces were already selling fast. And the ladies running the sale, sweet as pie, looked confused. Stolen, they said. No, your foster daughter brought it. She said it was your donation. It's listed in your name. That's when Mrs. Banks realized what I'd done. Not the donation, the spotlight. Because now, if she kept screaming, she wasn't a victim. She was a greedy woman trying to claw back a church donation in front of everyone. So she did the only thing she could do. She doubled down. She ranted. She cursed. She tried to chase down buyers like the pieces were stolen organs. And in a town like ours, that kind of behavior spreads faster than the flu. People didn't hear, "She's upset." They heard, "She donated a priceless set, and now she wants it back." They heard, "She's not godly, she's materialistic." The banks spent years polishing their image, and it cracked in one afternoon. By the time the sale ended, the china was gone, piecemeal, scattered all over the county. Cups, saucers, plates, little serving pieces, sold to women who would brag about it for years. And the church made more money than it ever had. Mrs. Banks, on the other hand, made a memory she couldn't outrun. Not even in a new Volvo. In a small town, people will forgive a lot. They'll forgive gossip. They'll forgive bad moods. They'll even forgive hypocrisy, if you keep it quiet. But they do not forgive a public tantrum, in a church, over a donation. Especially not from the woman who built her whole identity on being godly. Mrs. Banks didn't just lose the china that day. She lost the one thing she actually cared about: believability. By Sunday, the story had already spread past the county line. Not the truth. Not the details. Just the headline people love. Did you hear? Mrs. Banks donated some fancy plates, and then tried to take them back. From the church. In front of everyone. And because I wasn't there to defend myself, nobody could accuse me of stirring it up. It was pure, homegrown outrage. The kind you can't argue with. Mrs. Banks tried, though. She tried to reframe it like she'd been betrayed. Like I'd stolen from her. But every time she pushed that story, it made her look worse. Because the church ladies could say one sentence that ended her. She brought it in your name. The Banks had spent years collecting praise, and they lost it to a handwritten tag. A week later, they got a package by registered mail. Not a church bulletin, not a casserole. A legal envelope. Inside was my binder. Statements, dates, totals. A clean list of the things they bought that didn't match their paychecks. Cars, trips, gifts, donations, and the slow drain of money that was never meant for them. And attached to it was a letter from my attorney. Not emotional, not dramatic, just cold and clear. It said in professional language, "Do not contact her again for money. Do not threaten. Do not harass. If you do, You will receive a bill and a court date. That letter did something my childhood never could. It made them understand I wasn't a kid they could manage anymore. They wanted compensation for raising me. So I gave them an invoice for exploiting me. After that, it was quiet. No more guilt sermons, no more family speeches, no more pretending. Because they'd finally met a boundary that had teeth. 10 years later, here's the part that still makes me laugh, softly, to myself. I'm a third-grade teacher now. I married an accountant. Yes, I know, poetic. We have 2 kids, a little boy and a little girl. And our home is calm in a way that still feels unreal sometimes. Kitty and I reconnected as adults. Turns out, when she got out from under her parents' roof, she could finally breathe. She apologized for how she treated me when we were kids. We're friends now. We meet for lunch. Our kids play together. She told me she's been in therapy for years because of her parents. I believed her immediately. Because you don't grow up in a house like that and come out untouched. And Mr. and Mrs. Banks? They're still in that small town. Not because they love it, because they can't afford to leave. Their reputation is permanent now. The couple who drove both girls away, who lived off a dead man's money, and then tried to take their Baroque china back from Jesus. And every time somebody sees that old Volvo in the driveway, they remember. I hope it was worth it. Because in the end, they didn't just lose the china, they lost the town that used to clap for them.